On August 6, 1945, the Allies dropped the first atom bomb, Little Boy, on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb, Fat Man, struck the port of Nagasaki. On the 15th of August, Japan's Emperor Hirohito called on his people to bear the unbearable and laid down their arms. When the news of the Japanese surrender reached Kunming, people ran into the streets playing gongs, banging drums, and setting off fireworks in celebration. Among those excited crowds were the remaining members of the Overseas Transport Volunteers, for whom, after their years in limbo, the war was finally over. The records in the Yunnan Provincial Archive show that the fresh young transport volunteers of 1939 look very different from the same individuals 6 years later in 1945. The years of war and uncertainty had aged them all. But now, with the war over, there was a new complication. During their 6 years in Yunnan, many had married and started families. What were they to do now? Stay in China or head back across the South China Sea? In 1945, Wang Jiagui and Lord Chun Feng had been married 3 years and had already had 2 children together. They decided to head south.
我也报名了，我把那手术都办了，护照什么都领了。
After getting their travel documents, they sold all their possessions and bought their tickets. But just as Wang Jiagui was looking forward to a long-awaited reunion with his family, his wife, Lord Chun Feng, suddenly got cold feet.
他明天要上车了，今晚上他自己说他不走了，他说叫我一个人走。
This was a huge shock, and Wang had no idea what had made his wife suddenly change her mind.
我家里面呢有小弟弟，有老人，所以呢我带着回去。他跟着我说，那时候也有着小孩了，是吧？所以我不想回去。
他说他不走了，所以我没办法，我还是要留下来。
Devoted to his young wife, Wang Jiagui abandoned his plan to go back to Malaya. He returned their tickets, and the couple went to live with her parents at Baoshan in Yunnan province. Since marrying in May 1942, they have been together now 72 years. Xu Haixing is another one who chose to stay on after the war's end. His driving ability saw him signed up by the Kuomintang's 71st Army. When negotiations between the Communists and the Nationalists broke down in 1946, Xu's unit was transferred to the strategically important Northeast. It would be at Saping in Jilin province where Xu would encounter his first love.
他父亲就是大学生，父亲没有了，有一个妹妹，有个弟弟。
Huang Min had fallen in love with this handsome young soldier, but she was too shy to ask him out. Eventually, she summoned her courage and asked the friend to deliver 2 film tickets to him. That was to be their very first date.
中午1点钟开营，我就去。他是在那边鹿野机票当机票员，那时候我也不知道谁拿给我的戏票啊，我去看，就1等票，还要有半个小时以后他才来，因为还卖票。 来了，我一看，前后面都没有人，他的票是对数的，作为对数，专门找了空的。
In the fall of 1946, Xu Haixing and Huang Min decided to marry. They wanted to start their own family. But with political turmoil closing in around them, where could they find a place to start their new life?
本来我想留在东山城，那时候我有准备买一个苹果园的安东。
But the war had now come to the region. In February 1947, the Communist Northeast Field Army besieged a key fortress outside Changchun. Then Xu's unit was ordered to break the siege, but after breaking through the Communists' lines, they found themselves trapped inside.
第3天突围过不去，过不了，因为我开的吉普车手榴弹丢在前面。 那么我跳下去以后，被机关枪打到，要不然我可以走掉。
When Xu Haixing came to, he found himself in an army field hospital in Changchun. His wounds were so serious that he was shipped to Shenyang for surgery. Just as he was being taken into the operating theater, his fiancée appeared.
找到我99后方医院，那时候第1天就动手术，那么就一直看着我6个月。
It was almost 200 kilometers from Saping to Shenyang, with numerous sets of military lines, both nationalist and communist, to cross. But in sub-zero temperatures, the 18-year-old Huang Min had succeeded in doing so to be with a man she loves. After his surgery, Huang Min stayed by Xu Haixing's side, nursing him for the next 6 months. The delay in his treatment had meant that part of Xu's upper arm had needed to be amputated. Meanwhile, the conflict in the Northeast was intensifying. As the KMT forces suffered a series of crushing blows, Xu Haixing faced a tormenting choice.
以后怎么生活，怎么对待他，我以后回去又怎么样，我都想过。我决定不告诉他，送他回去。
In order not to be a burden to Huang Min, Xu Haixing had decided to leave and return to Southeast Asia alone.
要过年工作我就叫他送回去，你不要管我，我在这里。其实我就要走，也不告诉他，地址也没有，什么都没有，越使他更加伤心。
On the first day of the Chinese New Year in 1948, with a storm blowing across the city, Huang Min left Shenyang. As soon as she had gone, Xu Haixing applied to be released from military service. In 1948, as Xu Haixing and Huang Min were parted, another former transport volunteer, Wang Yunfeng, was also on the move. He was being transferred to the KMT front lines in East China. Wang was sick of war. It had been 12 years since he had left his wife and young child in Hainan, and he wanted to go home. In 1936, the 20-year-old Wang Yunfeng had left his hometown in Hainan and traveled to Singapore. He dreamed of making his fortune in gold mining. He left his wife and newborn baby behind. But the following year, the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out. In 1939, Hainan fell to the Japanese, and Wang lost contact with his wife. In desperation, his wife, Li Xue Lian, decides to go to Singapore to search for her husband.
我母亲就带我去南洋找他。我们去到南洋的时候，听说我父亲已经不在南洋了。
Just 1 month before, Wang Yunfeng had joined the Overseas Transport Volunteers. He was now working as a driver on the Burma Road. Then in February 1942, Singapore fell to the Japanese. Li Xue Lian found herself trapped on the island, still with her young son to look after.
那时候就是说，日本人有这样说：如果你没有老公在新加坡，你就要嫁给这个日本人，或也是当这个日本妓女，日本人就不差你。所以在这个情况下呢，我这个妈妈呢，逼着找不到这个黄爸了，就要这个。 必须要嫁人。
A Mr. Kong, also from Hainan, took responsibility for Li Xue Lian and her son. After the victory over the Japanese, Wang Yunfeng had planned to return to Hainan. But he found himself conscripted into the KMT artillery. he was sent to the battlefields of the Wuhan campaign in the east. It was there that he decided to desert and join the PLA instead. As the communist armies fought their way south, Wang was excited to be getting closer to his home province. But in 1950, Wang found himself in the Chinese People's Volunteer Army fighting in the Korean War. In 1952, after being wounded in Korea, Wang Yunfun was invalided out of the army and finally returned home to Hainan. The home he had left 16 years earlier was still there, but his wife and son were nowhere to be seen. After a desperate search yielded no results, Wang came to believe they must have been killed in the war. But not only was Li Xue Lian alive, she was living back in Hainan.
49年那个我们国家大陆解放了，人家都盼望着回国。我妈呢就跟我爸告别，朝鲜的志愿军回来呢，那么就在我们镇上开大会。那我妈呢就看到大会上说，讲话的是，朝鲜回国的模范英雄，原来由我黄爸上会以后，那么就去找我黄爸了，两个人又相依了。
However, the meeting was scarcely an end to Li Xue Lian's problems. She now had the dilemma. Should she get back together with her first husband, Wang Yunfun, in Hainan, or should she return to Singapore to be with her second husband?
他个人能够参加革命抗美援朝，又能够参加济公，能够打日本，所以他有这份爱国心和爱人民的心，那就可以够老婆去欣赏的了。那个年代的女人呢，她欣赏的也不是金钱，所以他们要选的是能够爱一个人，能够爱情坚定的人，对生活有希望的人。
After 16 long years, Wang Yunfun and Li Xue Lian were finally reunited. A tale of love and loyalty that had withstood the most extraordinary tests. At the southern reaches of the South China Sea, a venerable Xu Haisheng is now head of a large family. Despite the passage of time, some things never fade in his memory, especially Wang Min, the first love he left without a goodbye.
一直到了沙老爷27年后，我才写信他，看他还在不在。 结果写信视频间找不到人，第一封信、第二封信，才邮差查这个户口，查到他调到长春，那么才通信。
One afternoon in 1977, 30 years after he stole away in secret from the Shenyang hospital, Xu Haisheng received a first letter from Wang Min.
他说他找了6年，没办法找不到，就嫁了个姓介的。4年分了又当寡妇，2个孩子。 一男一女。
For the next 20 years, Xu Haisheng and Wang Min wrote to each other regularly. However, their relationship could never be the same as it once was.
从信上看，你很怀念过去，虽然那过去像我和您的距离一样遥远，然而那远去的一切仍然历历，犹如昨日。我今年65岁了，过生日时，孩子们为我操办得很热闹，还拍了不少的照片。有一片我很喜欢，献给您寄去一张，看看您的妹妹我老到什么程度了。头发全白了，但还是很健康，是吗？已经30年了，过去的，除了您对我的情谊之外，我都不记得，所以也谈不到原谅与否。您说呢？现在看来，您当时的决定是对的。当时我太小，不懂事。现在我完全理解，对此您千万不要自责。关于您和我的这段情谊，我永远铭记在心。但是我不能将这段美好的记忆告诉任何人，也不想写这段故事。没有更多的奢望，只是请求上天能给我们多一点健康，彼此通通信，也就满足了。
At 15, he learned that his father had been a member of the Overseas Transport Volunteers. At 40, he began to search for his father. After 30 years of searching, including checking every graveyard where volunteers were buried, he learned the truth about his father, a forgotten hero of the war. Please join us for Part 6 of the Overseas Transport Volunteers.
现在都在为我父亲的事，等到遗骨在哪里埋在哪里，我们也想去看，结果呢也没有得到落实，想到自己确实也感到相当不舍。
Ye Xiaodong can't remember how many times he has gone out in search of a man who died over 70 years ago. When he was 15, he was told that his father had been an overseas transport volunteer. When Ye was 40, he began to search for any traces he could find of the man who was his father. But there seemed to be none.
当时我父亲遇难的位置也去找过呢，变化也比较大。当时只是说是在一个塘有个水塘边，嘎，那么就记到那个水塘。现在水塘呢，边边那些都种满了菜，嘎，就是我们去找呢，确实也认不准哪一个地点。
Another search passes in vain. The wind blows gently through the trees. The tranquility of the valley belies the fact that 70 years earlier, it was the site of a brutal war crime. On May 5, 1942, the Chinese army destroyed the Huitong Bridge over the New Jiang River to prevent its capture by the Japanese. But Ye Xiaodong's father, Chen Tuan-Yuan, was one of the overseas transport volunteers driving on the Burma Road who were left stranded in enemy territory. Chen Tuan-Yuan's new bride, a local Dai girl called Lang Yu Bao, had just given birth to a baby boy.
就在忙事，东躲西藏啊，因为日本人要抓他们，他们就到了法帕的一家太叔家，去避难，每一天呢，跟着放牛娃娃到山上去放牛，白天，晚上呢才赶回家，也甚至于在那家太叔家还把他打扮成太叔，把他起了太叔名字。
This is a Dai coat that belonged to Chen Tuan-Yuan, one of the few things that has come down to Ye Xiaodong. Chen Tuan-Yuan lived disguised as a Dai for 2 months before someone informed on him. The Japanese decided to bury Chen alive as a punishment. When a Dai woman heard of the news, she took Lang Yubao to the scene. There, they watched as Chen Tuan-Yuan breathed his last breath.
听老大妈讲是哎呦，他们枪长得很，就是指着这些人，给这些人看着活埋我父亲。当时他去到那边呢，去看了，已经埋到胸脯了，土，他说看着脸色都不是人的脸色了，眼都看到，所以说是我妈呢就在那就叫就哭。 就叫的呢，那就捂着我妈的嘴呢，就把我妈就2个人拉回就走掉了。
Lang Yubao witnessed her husband being buried alive, a memory that would haunt her for the rest of her life. When it happened, Ye Xiaodong was just 3 months old. His mother was reluctant to share the story with him. Until he was an adult, he only knew the vaguest details about his father.
证件、照片都没有留下一张，都着日本人全部，拿跑完了，毁完了，所以说是，连我现在长到那么大，今年也快70了，都没有见过我父亲。
In 2012, a photo exhibition celebrating the overseas transport volunteers was held at Muar in Malaysia. Ye Xiaodong went all the way there, hoping that he might see his father's face. Unfortunately, Chen Tuan-Yuan's picture was not among them.
麻坡参加这个篮球机构呢，人数也比较多，也享受各种各样的球道。他们说是我父亲呢，可能是报了假名来参加这个篮球机构。
If, like many others, Chen Tuan-Yuan was using a nom de guerre when he joined the volunteers, Ye Xiaodong's search is likely to be in vain. The Qingming Festival is the time of year when the Chinese pay tribute to their ancestors and visit family tombs. With no grave site and no photograph, each year Ye Xiaodong has no other way to commemorate his father than with an empty picture frame.
在这名字底下给他记下来，给他磕个头，也就是给他磕个头。
Over 1,000 of the volunteers lie buried along the length of the Burma Road, often in sites which are unmarked. Trying to identify their graves, to commemorate them all, is all but impossible. But it became a quest which Lin Fu Lai was to pass on to his adopted son.
每年的时候啊，就是在这个什么清明节和这个77的时候，这个77卢沟桥事变，每年基本上都是在房间里面不出来，连吃早点他就躺着了，这种寡默无言了。
Lin Fu Lai and Lin Xiaocheng are not related by blood. They met in 1983 when the younger man, Huang Xiaocheng, was working as a trader in Burma. Lin Fu Lai, already advanced in years, was on a mission, constantly crossing the border. Impressed by the older man's dedication and service to his country, Xiaocheng decided to help him, and they established a close relationship.
到1986年的时候，我父亲就提出个要求，他说：“阿查，他说今天我们到缅甸的时候，棒晒观音寺，这个观音寺是华人的观音寺，里面有和尚、有尼姑、有方丈。他说已经跟老方丈说好了，这个为我们主持接汤的时候父子相恋这个仪式。哎，我说我都没有准备的时候，来的时候很突然，想了一个晚上。”
In Confucian philosophy, the father-son relationship is second only to that between ruler and subject. In Chinese culture, with its long tradition of ancestor worship, it's the most important social relationship, bar none. To formalize an adopted relationship as father and son is the most serious of commitments. It means the two men are bound together for eternity, as the son undertakes to continue his father's ancestral line.
方丈就跟我说：“阿长，从今天起，你是林福来的儿子，你永远，你活是林家的人，死是林家的鬼，你要想清楚。”我说我没有什么再有后顾之忧，没有考虑。
Huang Xiaocheng thereby became Lin Xiaocheng. But he wasn't just inheriting the Lin name, he was becoming the living heir to the memory of the transport volunteers. It was a boon to Lin Fu Lai's old age to have found a family to replace a past so haunted by the memory of his fallen colleagues. However, he could never forget them entirely, and so he came to share some of his memories with his son.
我现在这个联络站里面的时候，把这个骨灰拿给他父亲，但是我父亲就跟他的父亲说，他的女儿子当时在临死之前要求这个骨灰不能拿回马来西亚，必须要埋在我们的时候，这个滇缅公路上，看到我们祖国的大好河山，看到的时候，我们中国人完全有能力立刻赶出国门。后来他父母那个路易还言路易之敌，后来还是遵照儿子的意思，他说那好，就去找一个地， 把他的骨灰埋上去。
When he buried his friend's ashes, Lin Fulai marked the site so that he could visit it in the years to come. However, when he finally got back to visit the grave more than 30 years later, the marker was gone and the road itself had changed. He regretted leaving it so long to return. When Lin Fulai died in 1995, he was still burdened by this regret. In fulfillment of his father's last request, Lin Xiaocheng took it upon himself to build a memorial for the overseas transport volunteers. It took him a decade to build the 16-meter-high monument on the top of Bonglong Mountain, just north of Wanding. The monument bears the names of all 3,200 volunteers. There are 3 other monuments built to commemorate the overseas transport volunteers. The first was built in Kuala Lumpur in 1947. The second was erected in Penang in 1951. And in 1989, the third was officially inaugurated in Kunming on the 52nd anniversary of the outbreak of the war. Every day, Ye Xiaodong rides his motor scooter to work at the Monument Management Committee. He is one of the monument's guardians. He spends a lot of time wiping off dust from the monument, touching his father's name again and again.
能够天天在这收到，因为父亲的名字就在这，像他一直跟他在一起一样的，是吧？
After working at the monument for 8 years, Ye Xiaodong feels that the 3,200 names inscribed here each seem to have some warmth and a life of their own. Each name represents a real man or woman who was someone's son or daughter, father or mother, brother or sister, boyfriend or girlfriend. The monument has become like an ancestral hall for the brotherhood of those who served on the Burma Road. In 1939, Xu Haixing was just 19 when he joined the Overseas Transport Volunteers. He would return to Malaya a decade later, bearing scars both mental and physical. He started a new life as a small trader in his hometown. Xu got to know a local I-band chieftain and his younger sister. He soon married the I-band girl. The couple turned to agriculture for their living, working the fields from dawn to dusk. But they prospered and were able to raise 8 children together. In 2014, Xu Haixing was able to celebrate his 94th birthday with his 2 sons and 6 daughters. When Li Yaliu returned to Malaysia in 1946, only his younger sister was there to greet him. The Japanese authorities had taken revenge on his family for his resistance work in China. His younger brother had been executed, and his father was forced to flee into the mountains where he was to die of disease. The year after his return, Li bought a minibus and started his own transport business. he named his bus Kunming. When World War II ended, Wang Tie-hun found himself in India. He became a seaman, traveling all over the world. In Los Angeles, the handsome sailor found himself much admired by the local girls. But in 1946, he returned to Malaysia and took out a lease on a rubber plantation of 2,700 trees. Now in his retirement, Wang still rides his motorcycle most days down to the cafe for a cup of coffee. In Yunnan, 96-year-old Lor Kai-hu also maintains the drinking coffee habit. Special guests are offered the white coffee grown in Malaysia. In 1949, Lor took a job in the main hardware company in Kunming. These days, he spends his time growing flowers, reading newspapers, and taking leisurely walks. Wang Jiagui prefers the real coffee he makes himself, as opposed to instant. It's a legacy of his days as a chef in Southeast Asia, all those years ago, before he came to China. On November 11, 2013, with his wife surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, Wang celebrated his 100th birthday. In Hainan, the 96-year-old Wu Zhongbiao is still healthy and active. He rises every morning at 5:30, and after jogging or Tai Chi boxing, cooks himself breakfast. He receives a pension of 2,000 yuan per month from the Chinese government. In 1945, after 10 years away from home, Wu finally saw his mother again. It was she who sold the only plot of land the family owned to make it possible for him to seek his future abroad. In Sarawak, Malaysia, Fung Zeng Biao is taking a well-earned nap. More than 70 years ago, his first-rate skills as a mechanic made him a senior instructor for the transport volunteers. After the war, he returned to Sarawak on his own. At 28, he got married and opened his own garage. In his home, he still proudly displays the award he won as an overseas transport volunteer. With his sight failing, he can no longer read what it says, but that doesn't matter because its meaning is engraved on his heart. In a hospital bed in Guangzhou, 98-year-old Bai Shui Jiao lives out the final days of her life. In 1939, this teacher from a wealthy middle-class family gave up a life of comfort to return to China as a volunteer. The farewell letter she wrote to her parents inspired thousands of overseas Chinese to dedicate themselves to the cause of anti-Japanese resistance. It was at the Qingming Festival of 2014 when the flame of this remarkable life finally went out. The dwindling band of survivors, now are all well past 90 years of age, is a last connection with the unsung heroes of the Burma Road. The men and women who gave up their dreams or gave up comfortable lives to answer the call of their motherland in its hour of need. The Overseas Transport Volunteers.
没有后悔，一点都没有。我认为我在上面很光荣。
不怕死啦，还怕累吗？还怕干辛苦吗？是吧？我不怕的。回来，
不会，不后悔。 我们是为了大日本的。
每年到过节啊，国家很照顾人家。
没有说好后悔的，这种没有后悔。
小时候也有问过妈妈的，我妈呢，在我5岁左右吧。
黄河在咆哮吧，很好的。但现在啊，我这个
不懂得唱歌，
不懂得唱歌。
红了会上。
那个嘛。
鬼子们的口上扛起。